to an audience of this size and of this nature, and so she's. I'm hoping she's not too nervous, but be very gentle and appreciative and loving to her. And I would love to take a moment and pray for our sister and ask that God would bless her teaching tonight. So can you join me in a prayer for that? God, I thank you for Amiee. I thank you for how you've been stirring and moving in her heart, how you've been really prompting her and leading her. God, so much information that you poured out into her through other resources, through the Bible, through your word, through prayer. God, I pray that you would bring a supernatural clarity, that you would speak so clearly, God, that she would step out of the way and that you would speak so loudly tonight that we can't help but hear the message that you have for us. I pray that you would bless Amiee tonight in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen.
Sorry, I'm all sweaty. That's all right. That was some good worship, you guys. You know, this is my first time, so I have my iPad, and I have a lot of notes written down. And, you know, as Thomas and I were conversing about, you know, what were our next steps in, I shared my heart about wanting to teach on worship. He was just so generous in letting me kind of own tonight and take over and do that. And so I'm very excited. You know, worship is my passion. It's my favorite thing to do, and I could talk all day about it. And I feel like God has really given me a word for his people, and I just really wanted to share that. And I have to tell you, I love worship and I've studied worship, but in this past week I've never studied it or researched it as much as I have this week. And it's been amazing. Like things that I never even thought about as worship, God showed me just those things were worship. And so I would love to share some of that stuff with you. But I just kind of wanted to start with, you know, kind of my heart on worship and kind of where I want to see us go and stuff like that. And then we'll get into the meat of it. You know, I became a worship leader a couple of years ago, and I just really felt God pulling me into it. I was pursuing a secular career. You'll hear more of my story later, but as I started kind of leading people, I just really had a passion to see people encounter God the way that I have encountered God and feel his presence the way that I have felt his presence in my life. And he's just been so amazing and showed up in so many different areas of my life and healed my life in such amazing ways that I really want you guys to experience that same power that I felt in my life. So I just kind of want to take us back to the first time that we fell in love with the presence of God. And I want you to meditate on that for a second and just look back and think about when was that time, because it's profound. You don't really forget about the first time that you really fell in love with God, if you have yet. And I just kind of I love that because we all have different stories. We all have different stories. We have different moments when we were being pursued by God, where he was setting us up to win. I love that. And so I kind of want to just share my story and kind of how I got into worship, and then we'll go from there. You know, I grew up in a Christian home. My mom became a Christian when she was 23 or so, and she raised us in the church. My dad believes in God, but he doesn't go to the church, so she raised us solely in the church. So I've been a Christian my whole life, and I've been singing in church actually since I was 3 years old. She used to sing in church, so I get my gifts from my mom. And she pulled me up on stage. I don't even remember the song we sang. Do you?
Mm-hmm. Thorns on his head.
Thorns on his head? Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a good song. So I was 3 years old, and she pulled me up on stage to sing. That's an oldie. I don't know. Some of you.
Oh, actually, how could you say no?
Huh? How could you say no? Okay. Anyway, 3 years old. So God was already, you know, shaping my life from the time I was 3 years old. He knew I was going to be a worship leader from the time I was 3. And that's the amazing thing about God, is he knows the plan. He has plans for our lives, and he takes us on this journey, and he always fulfills his purpose in our life. And all my life, up until a specific point, I can't remember any huge encounters with God. You know, I never understood being in his presence. I sang in church, but it was never really meaningful. My mom would raise her hands, and I was like, crazy lady, what is this person doing? I'd be like, Mom, put your hands down, you know, because I didn't understand. I didn't know why she did it. And that's because I was never taught. I was never taught what worship was. I was never taught how to worship and the importance of worship. Until I was about 21 years old, I had a major encounter with God, and it changed my life, you guys. Worship changes us from the inside out, and it really did. I felt his presence so powerfully, and he began refining me and transforming me, and he's been doing that ever since. That's the amazing thing about God. He doesn't stop doing that. He continues doing that. But because of my disobedience in the past, and because I kind of fell off onto the crazy train, I experienced a lot of pain and a lot of hurt. And that's why it's so important to continue to pursue God and continue being in relationship with him, because when we walk our separate way and when we decide we want to do our own thing, just bad things happen. And, I became caught up in a lot of things, addiction, just a lot. I experienced tragedy and loss at its deepest, and it was super painful. But like I said, God was setting me up, and just the redemption is so amazing. So why study worship? Why are we here? Why am I speaking on worship? Well, number one, like I said, I didn't understand it until I was taught. And I want to read you this statement. I was reading a book called How to Worship a King by Amiee, and he made this heart-wrenching statement. And this is what he said: worship needs to be taught, because if we don't teach people about worship, how can we expect people to participate in it? And if people don't engage in worship, how can we expect to invite the presence of God into our churches? And if we don't invite the presence of God into the church, how can we expect his power to operate in our lives? And if his power is not operating in our lives, how can we expect to have anything other than a lifeless church? And if the church is lifeless, how can it change the world? Isn't that intense? That gripped my soul, because I don't want us to be a lifeless church. I want us to be a church that pursues the presence of God. So that just really gripped my heart, and I wanted to share that with you. Another reason we study worship is because there's so much confusion and so little understanding and practice of worship. And, many people have these well-intentioned but false, based on tradition, upbringing, and personal preference. And when we fail to honor God when we operate in false assumptions, or we fail to honor God when we operate in false assumptions. I know a lot of us come from different backgrounds and different upbringings, but some of those things that we've learned over time are biblical, and they're false, and they don't honor God, and we really need to honor God in our worship, because he created us to worship him. The next reason we're studying worship is, unfortunately, because of the severe consequences of false worship. And let me just give you a couple examples of what happened to people when they worshiped God falsely. In Genesis 4:5, we see that Cain's sacrifice was rejected by God because it was false worship. You remember Cain and Abel? Well, God blessed Abel's sacrifice, but he rejected Cain's because it was false. 3,000 people died in one day because of the false worship of the golden calf fashioned by Aaron in Exodus 32. And if you're here a couple weeks ago, this is so funny, but I was talking about how I hated Exodus. And you remember that? And I have to tell you, the minute those words came out of my mouth, about, half an hour after church, I was just reading, and all of a sudden God started showing me all these ways in Exodus where people actually worshipped him, and it was funny. So that's and I was like, okay, I'm sorry, God. I will never do that again. Another severe consequence that happened was the kingdom of Israel was divided because of the idolatry and false worship of the nation in 1 Kings. Misdirected worship was the cause of untold hardship and suffering in the Old Testament. In the first chapter of Romans, Paul wrote that God was justified in condemning man because he worshipped in error. And he says in Romans 1:25, "For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever." Satan fell from heaven because he sought worship for his own self. And when we don't worship God properly, we're creating idols in our life. We're putting things above God, because we're created to worship. We're worshiping beings, and so we worship something. So I want to ask you a question. What do you worship? If it's not God, it's false, and it's unacceptable to him. Oh, yeah. And the last reason, and by far the primary one, for considering this subject of worship worthy of our consideration is because worship is of great importance to God. Like I said, he created us to be worshipers of himself. So here's what I hope you leave with tonight. I hope you leave with a clear revelation of God who desires worship to be the focal point and passion of our lives. I hope you leave with a solid understanding of the biblical foundation that leads us to become true worshipers. And I hope that you are challenged to enter into biblical authenticity in your worship inside the doors of the church and also outside. And we'll get to that more later. But yeah, as you respond to God's revelation evidenced in your daily life. So we're going to kind of dive into Scripture, and we're going to see what God says about worship and how we should worship him. And in John 4:23 through 24, he says, "But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth." And so this verse is saying that if there are true worshipers, there are also false worshipers, which we kind of discussed just a second ago. I've had a lot of conversations about worship, and I've heard a lot of Christians say that you can worship God any way you like. But clearly, in this verse, you cannot. There are different forms of worship, but nowhere in the Bible does it say that we can worship God however we want. Worship is selfless, and it's all about him and what he says about worshiping him. A lot of us show up on the weekend and we sing songs and we listen to the sermon and we get pumped up, but that doesn't cut it, you guys. We can't just show up on a weekend and expect God to transform our lives if we just come to a service. This needs to be a constant thing. It needs to be a daily thing. Worship isn't just songs and singing. That's only part of it. But there's way more to it, and it's not just showing up. It's living our lives. It's a lifestyle. It's an action. It's not just something we observe. So what does it mean to worship in spirit and truth? I kind of talked about this last weekend if you were here. To worship in spirit means that we give God our full attention. We give him our hearts, our full devotion, our undivided attention, distraction-free worship, where we're just connected and in tune with him, and nothing around us matters. In Deuteronomy 6:5 it says, "To love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and strength." We express adoration, love, and thanks to him for who he is and what he's done for us. To worship in truth means to worship according to Scripture. So we sing songs that are based out of the Bible, that are lined up according to Scripture. And Jesus clearly states that we must worship him in this way, in spirit and in truth, not any way we like. Otherwise, our worship is unacceptable to him, and our worship is vain. Worship is sacrificial. We offer ourselves to God, and we shouldn't be offering just in part, but wholly. So if there's things holding you back from God, we need to let those things go in worship and be honest with God. It's okay. It's okay. I am just going to be very authentic right now. There's times where I walk into a worship service and I'm like, man, God, I'm just not feeling it today. But I have to be honest with him because he appreciates that. He wants us to be honest with him, because in those moments when we're honest and we're saying, God, I'm not feeling like worshiping you, he can come in and he can change our hearts, and he does that for me quite a bit. And I love worship, but I'm human. And there are days where I'm just tired, and I have a 6-month-old, and I don't feel like singing. But I do, because he's worthy and he's deserving of my praise and of your praise. In worship, we should be giving the best we have, not the leftovers. All throughout the Old Testament, which I've been reading, God demands the very best from his people. We see that the people offer the firstlings of the flock, the firstborn of man and animal, the first fruit of harvest. And thank God we don't have to make animal sacrifices anymore. But instead, we offer ourselves. We don't have to go slaughter an animal and lay it on an altar. We just have to give them ourselves. Acts 20:35 says, "It is more